The rain had started early that morning, a steady, whispered tapping on the windows of Boulevard Richard Lenoir, just enough to soak the collars of overcoats and turn the sidewalks into a ribbon of grey mirrors. It was a Thursday, late October, and Paris seemed suspended between the memory of warmth and the inevitability of winter. Chief Inspector Maigret sat in his usual corner of the Brasserie Dauphine, nursing a glass of beer that had grown warm and flat while his gaze wandered. He wasn't in uniform, nor on duty, not really. The office had been quiet that week, the sort of bureaucratic calm that made the corridors of the Quai des Orfèvres feel heavier than when they buzzed with murder. Maigret had promised Madame Maigret he'd be home by noon. She had planned cabbage soup, his favorite, and was expecting him to help choose a new tablecloth from the market. But here he was, coat still damp, pipe resting cold beside his untouched beer, waiting for something he couldn't name. There was a newspaper folded neatly on the table. He'd read the headlines without interest. A minister's scandal, another factory strike, a robbery in Montreal. Nothing called to him. Nothing. Except perhaps the last page, a short column about a peculiar incident in the 17th arrondissement. Buried near the classifieds, a man found dead in a house on Rue des Acacias. No sign of struggle, no forced entry, no clear cause. The house, it said, had no windows. That last detail made him pause. No windows? He reread it. Yes, a narrow house, walled on both sides by taller buildings, with no windows facing the street. A relic, the article explained, of some long-forgotten urban zoning oddity. A neighbor had noticed the front door ajar. Inside, a man dead in a chair. 48 hours had passed before anyone noticed. Maigret lit his pipe, more out of rhythm than desire, and watched the smoke curl gently into the cafe's warm air. Across the room, the clerks from the prefecture were arguing softly about tram fares. A waiter wiped down a table with slow, circular strokes. Outside, a man in a soaked cap tapped a match against his thumb, but never lit it. There was nothing. Official drawing Maigret to Rue des Acacias. The case, if there even was one, had been handed to a junior inspector from the 17th, young, eager, and likely blind to the nuances that Maigret always felt in the air more than he saw in the facts. And yet he felt something, not a suspicion, not even a curiosity, more a weight, a presence, as if the house itself, blind, silent, forgotten, had breathed its last into that room, and someone ought to listen. He stood slowly, slipped on his coat, and left a few coins beside the empty glass. The collar scratched against his neck, still damp. He didn't rush. That was never his way. He walked past the damp shops and the grocer who nodded without smiling, past schoolchildren with bright umbrellas, and into the underground dot at the station platform. He leaned against the tiled wall, hands in pockets, breathing in the familiar, metallic scent of the metro tunnels. He wasn't thinking of suspects or cusses, not yet, just of a dead man in a windowless house. A man who might have died by accident, or loneliness, or perhaps simply because no one had seen him for 2 days. When the train arrived with its usual sigh of brakes and bodies, Maigret stepped in without hurry. He wouldn't announce himself at the precinct in the 17th. He'd go directly to Rue des Caches, just to see it, to feel it, to let it speak to him. The taxi jolted to a stop at the base of Rue des Caches, a narrow, dimly lit street tucked behind the more well-known thoroughfares of Paris. The buildings here leaned in toward one another, as if trying to keep some secret from being overheard. Margaret paid the driver, who seemed eager to be elsewhere, and stepped out into the drizzle. The rain had softened into a gentle mist, falling in sheets, blurring the outlines of everything. The house on Rue des Caches wasn't remarkable in any way, save for its lack of windows. It stood 3 stories high, flanked by 2 buildings whose windows stared blankly at each other across a few feet of brick. The door, a dull brown with flaking paint, had been left ajar, just as the newspaper described. Margaret paused for a moment before stepping up onto the narrow stone steps. He inhaled deeply, letting the wet earth and mildew scent of the street mix with the sharp smell of fresh rain on asphalt. A few neighbors lingered near the entrance, their eyes heavy with unspoken gossip. They didn't look at Margaret, or perhaps they simply didn't acknowledge him. His presence was not yet important to them. He raised a hand to the brass knocker on the door, but before he could knock, the door creaked open further. A man in his mid-50s, with a slightly crooked tie and a face marked by the kind of tiredness that comes from living alone for too long, stood in the doorway. "I'm Inspector Margaret," he said softly, his voice cutting through the silence like the rain. "I'm here to speak with the officer in charge." The man stepped aside, not saying a word, just pointing with a thin finger toward the interior. Margaret gave a short nod of thanks and entered. The hallway was narrow, lined with dark wood paneling that smelled faintly of mildew. The stairs to the upper floors creaked beneath his feet. As he made his way to the front room, the officer in charge, a young man with a nervous twitch in his eye, was pacing back and forth near the center of the room, where a small, round table stood, untouched by any kind of conversation or life. "Inspector," the officer greeted him, his voice edged with uncertainty. "We haven't found much. It's strange, sir. There's no sign of forced entry, no struggle, just the body, sitting there as if he was waiting for something." Margaret glanced around the room. The furniture was old, faded, the kind you'd expect to find in a boarding house that hadn't seen a tenant in years. There was a chair near the window, but the window itself, Margaret noticed, was covered with thick curtains that blocked out all light. The air was thick with a sense of something waiting, lingering. "And the man?" Margaret asked, his voice soft, almost a murmur. "His name was Charles Delacroix," the officer replied. "A businessman, some kind of investor. Lived here alone. Never seemed to have visitors." Margaret moved slowly across the room, observing the small details. The room smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and stale air, but there was no sign of any recent activity. No papers strewn about, no signs of a hurried departure or conflict. Just the man in the chair, dead, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his expression unreadable. Margaret crouched down beside the body, his eyes lingering on the details. The slight wear on the man's shoes, the faint indentation on his forehead, as if he had been staring at something for a long time before the end came. There was nothing about it that screamed violence. No blood, no sign of a struggle, just quiet. To quiet. How long was he dead before you found him? Maigret asked. At least 48 hours. Sir, the officer replied. Maigret's gaze flickered toward the windowless wall, and then back at the officer. Tell me about the house, he said, his voice low. No windows. Why? The officer hesitated, shifting his weight uneasily. It's an old building, built back in the 19th century. I don't know much about it, but I've heard the landlord's been trying to sell it for years. No one seems to care about it. Maigret let the words settle in the air, the dull echo of the officer's voice blending with the sound of the rain outside. There was nothing particularly remarkable about this place, nothing at all that would have drawn attention, except, perhaps, for the house itself, its silent walls hiding whatever secrets lay inside. Has anyone spoken to the landlord? Maigret asked. No, the officer replied quickly. I've sent someone to check, but he hasn't responded. Maigret stood up, turning his attention back to the body. Something wasn't right, but he couldn't yet say what. It wasn't in the way the man had died. It wasn't in the scene that greeted him. It was in the quiet, in the things left unsaid. He paused for a moment, letting his thoughts settle. Tell me, Maigret said, turning back to the officer, do you feel like this house, this room, is hiding something? The officer glanced around nervously. It's just an old building, Inspector. A man died in his chair, simple as that. Maigret's lips twitched into a small, knowing smile, though his eyes remained serious. We shall see. The rain had not ceased since Maigret arrived, and as he walked back out into the wet streets, the chill of the evening seemed to have settled deeper into his bones. The officer followed silently behind, his boots slapping against the cobblestones as they made their way toward the building's entrance. Maigret didn't speak, not yet. The noise of their footsteps seemed to echo unnaturally loud against the stillness of the street, where the occasional car drove by in the distance, its headlights barely cutting through the mist. Maigret's mind lingered on the house and the room he had just left. There was something about it that gnawed at him, something not quite right. It was as though the house itself had chosen to remain silent, forcing the secrets within to remain hidden. But Maigret knew better. People didn't keep secrets in silence alone. They kept them in the smallest, most ordinary gestures, a flick of the eye, a clenched fist, a voice trembling slightly when it should be steady. There are a few others to speak to, Inspector. The officer spoke, his voice breaking the silence. A neighbor, a former colleague of the victim, and the landlord. Which one is closest? Maigret asked. The former colleague, sir. He lives just around the corner. He was the last one to see Delacroix alive. Maigret nodded and continued walking. His shoes made soft slapping noises on the wet pavement, and he adjusted his collar against the cold wind that had begun to pick up. The office light on the second floor of the police headquarters was still on, but Maigret didn't care to return just yet. The cases always seemed to wait for him there. always waiting for his quiet attention. The former colleague's apartment was on the second floor of an aging building. On the corner of the street, the paint was peeling from the doorframe. The windowsill had collected a layer of grime, and the lights inside flickered faintly in the gloom. When Maigret knocked, a woman opened the door. An elderly lady with sharp eyes that made Maigret feel as though she could read his thoughts. Even though they had never met. "Who are you looking for?" she asked in a voice that was half question, half demand. "Jean-Luc Thibault," Maigret replied, showing his badge. The woman nodded gravely and stepped aside, allowing Maigret and the officer to enter. The apartment smelled of old paper, like the kind you find in dusty libraries that have been abandoned for too long. There were papers scattered on a desk near the window, and an old, worn chair sat in the center of the room. But the most striking thing was the man sitting in that chair, Jean-Luc Thibault himself. His face was gaunt, his skin pale, as though he hadn't seen sunlight in days. He wore glasses, perched precariously on the edge of his nose, and his clothes hung loosely from his frame, as though his body had been left behind by time. When he saw Maigret, Thibault's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, something fleeting and uneasy, that told the inspector all he needed to know. This was a man who was hiding something. "Good evening," Maigret said quietly, lowering his voice to match the somberness of the room. "I'm Inspector Maigret. I understand you knew Charles Delacroix." Thibault gave a slight nod. "I did. He was a business partner of mine. We worked together for several years." Maigret sat down opposite Thibault, noticing the way the man shifted slightly in his seat, as though unsettled by the presence of another. His gaze flickered around the room, never quite settling on Maigret's face. "Can you tell me about the last time you saw him?" Maigret asked, his tone gentle but probing. Thibault hesitated before answering, his fingers drumming nervously on the arm of the chair. "It was 3 days ago. We had a meeting about some investment opportunities. Nothing extraordinary. We spoke for about an hour. Nothing unusual. Just business. Then I left." "And where did you go after?" "Home. I haven't been out much. Too tired." Maigret watched him closely, but Thibault didn't meet his gaze. Instead, he stared at his hands, his fingers twisting in a restless manner. "I see," Maigret said, but his voice remained steady. "Did you notice anything unusual about Delacroix? Anything out of place?" Thibault's eyes darted to the corner of the room, then quickly back to Maigret. "No, he was, well, he was a businessman. The same as always." Maigret let the silence hang for a moment, then asked, "What did you discuss in your meeting?" "Money," Thibault said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We were trying to figure out how to save our investments. It wasn't going well. Charles was not in the best of moods. But that's normal when you lose money." Maigret didn't push further. He had the distinct feeling that Thibault was lying, not outright, but enough to make him uncomfortable. People like Thibault didn't just avoid eye contact when they were telling the truth. It wasn't his words that bothered Maigret, but the weight of his silence, the unspoken things. He stood up slowly, noting the way Thibault flinched at the movement. Thank you for your time. If you remember anything else, please don't hesitate to contact me." As Margaret and the officer left the apartment, the rain had intensified. It wasn't the kind of storm that made people rush for shelter, but one of those steady, persistent rains that seemed to cover everything in grey. The streets were almost deserted now, with the occasional figure huddling under an umbrella. Walking quickly towards some destination, Margaret's mind turned over the conversation with Thibault. The man's story was too neat, too rehearsed. But the questions weren't what bothered Margaret. It was the way Thibault's nerves had surfaced, the tremble in his voice, the restless fingers, the way he had avoided speaking more than he needed to. "He's hiding something," Margaret muttered, mostly to himself. "Yes, sir," the officer replied, glancing over at him. "But what?" "I don't know yet," Margaret said, "but I'll wait." The rain was still persistent as Margaret and the officer made their way through the narrow streets, their footsteps echoing softly on the cobblestones. The city felt quieter tonight, as if it were holding its breath, awaiting some revelation that had not yet come. The lights from the occasional passing car reflected on the wet pavement, casting fleeting shadows against the grey buildings. Margaret didn't speak as they walked. His thoughts were elsewhere, moving like the water in the gutters that trickled toward the Seine. Something about the case was unsettling him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He had been a detective long enough to know that the truth never arrived all at once. It always came in pieces, subtle and seemingly insignificant, until at last a pattern emerged. Their destination was a modest apartment building not far from where Delacroix had lived. The building's exterior was worn, the paint chipped, and the hallways dimly lit, casting long shadows that made the place feel almost haunted. Margaret didn't mind. The grittiness of the place was part of the charm. His work often took him to places like this, where the lives of the people inside seemed to be suspended in some forgotten corner of the world. The officer knocked on the door, and after a brief moment, it opened to reveal a middle-aged man with tired eyes. He was wearing a thick sweater, though the warmth inside the building had left him slightly flushed. The man's gaze was wary, and his posture stiff as though he was expecting trouble. "Inspector Margaret," the officer introduced. The man stepped back, allowing them inside. "Jean-Luc Thibault," he said, his voice a little too eager, as though trying to appear more accommodating than necessary. "Please, come in." Margaret stepped into the small apartment, the scent of stale air and cigarette smoke lingering in the cramped space. It was sparsely furnished, with a small table in the corner, several chairs strewn around the room, and a cluttered desk covered with papers. There was a half-empty bottle of wine on the table, as if the man had been drinking before their arrival. Thibault gestured for them to sit. "Please have a seat," he offered. Margaret took the chair closest to the door, the officer sitting beside him. Thibault remained standing, his hands fidgeting with the collar of his sweater. "I understand you knew Charles Delacroix," Margaret began, his voice low and measured. "Can you tell me about the last time you saw him?" Thibault seemed to hesitate for a moment, his gaze darting around the room before settling back on Margaret. "It was 3 days ago," he replied, his voice flat. "He came by for a brief meeting. We talked about business, investments, you know, the usual." "And how did he seem?" Margaret asked. Leaning forward slightly, his tone remained neutral, but his eyes were sharp, studying the man carefully. Thibault paused. "He was agitated, I suppose. We were both under pressure. There had been some losses recently, and we were trying to figure out what to do next." "Did he seem worried about something else?" Margaret pressed. "Something personal?" Thibault's eyes flickered for a moment, but he quickly masked it with a shrug. No, just business. I don't think anything else was bothering him." Margaret studied him for a moment longer, then stood up. "And after your meeting, where did he go?" "Home, I assume," Thibault replied, his voice a bit too quick, as if eager to dismiss the question. "Home?" Margaret repeated, watching him carefully. "I see." He paused, considering the man in front of him. Thibault seemed ordinary enough, but Margaret had long learned that appearances could be deceiving. There was something about the way the man held himself, the subtle tension in his shoulders, the nervous habit of touching his neck every few seconds. It all spoke to her, discomfort that couldn't be easily explained away. People like Thibault didn't act nervous unless they had something to hide. "Tell me about your relationship with Delacroix," Margaret asked, his voice still calm. "You say you worked together for years. Were you friends?" Thibault looked uncomfortable at the question. "We were colleagues," he replied stiffly. "There was no friendship." "Not in the way you mean it." "We were associates." "Associates," Margaret repeated. "And did anything change between you two recently?" Thibault hesitated again, then shook his head. "No, not really. Business got a bit harder, but nothing out of the ordinary. Like I said, we were just trying to figure things out." Margaret didn't push further, but something in Thibault's answer didn't sit right with him. People who were truly indifferent to one another didn't avoid eye contact so deliberately, didn't speak with such defensive tones. There was more to this than met the eye. "I see," Margaret said finally, taking out a small notebook from his coat pocket and jotting something down. He closed it and looked back at Thibault. "Thank you for your time. I may need to speak with you again later." Thibault nodded, but there was a strange look in his eyes now, one of relief mixed with unease. As Margaret and the officer left the apartment, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the answers were buried just beneath the surface. Waiting for the right moment to surface, they descended the staircase and stepped back out into the rain, which seemed to have intensified, as if in sympathy with the weight of the conversation that had just unfolded. Margaret pulled up the collar of his coat, the cold damp seeping into his bones. But he didn't mind. There was something soothing about the rain, something that mirrored the quiet, persistent unraveling of the case. As they walked back toward the street, Margaret's mind turned over what Thibault had said. The man's nervousness was telling, but it was his reluctance to offer more about their professional relationship that intrigued Margaret. People didn't avoid the truth unless they were afraid of what it might reveal. The way Thibault had minimized their connection, glossing over any deeper feelings, seemed intentional. Margaret wasn't looking for a confession. He didn't need a dramatic admission of guilt. He only needed to observe, to listen to the subtle signals people gave off when they were hiding something. "There's something in Thibault's story that doesn't add up," Maigret murmured, more to himself than to the officer. "Do you think he's involved?" the officer asked, his voice a little too eager. "I don't know yet," Maigret replied, "but I'll wait." The next morning, Maigret woke early, as was his habit. The rain had stopped, but the clouds lingered, heavy and foreboding. He sat at the small table by the window in his apartment, sipping his coffee slowly, the steam rising and mixing with the faint smell of cigarettes in the air. His wife, Louise, was already up and bustling around the kitchen, preparing breakfast. Maigret's gaze was distant, his thoughts still on the case. The image of Thibault's nervous face had stayed with him, gnawing at the edges of his mind. There was something about the way he had answered questions, the subtle shifts in his posture, the forced casualness in his tone. It wasn't quite guilt, but it was a discomfort that couldn't be ignored. Louise brought him a plate of scrambled eggs, her sharp eyes noticing the clouded expression on his face. She placed the plate gently in front of him, then sat down across from him, her hands folding neatly in front of her. "Another one of those cases, Jean?" she asked, her voice warm but laced with the quiet concern she had for him after years of marriage. Maigret didn't answer right away, taking another slow sip of his coffee. He wasn't one for long explanations in the mornings, preferring the silence between them. Louise understood this. Her silence matched his, and in that quiet, the understanding that had come with their years together spoke volumes. Finally, Maigret set the cup down and glanced at her. "It's to clean," he said simply, his voice low and thoughtful. "To tidy." "You're always saying that," she replied, with a small smile that suggested she'd heard it before. But Maigret could tell she was listening closely. "It doesn't feel right," he added. "I spoke to Thibault yesterday. He was hiding something. It's not just his nervousness, there's a story in that man's face. And I haven't gotten to the heart of it yet." "Do you think he killed Delacroix?" "I don't know," Maigret muttered, staring out the window at the grey sky. "But something's not adding up. He's avoiding something. And when people do that, they're either afraid of something or guilty of something." "I'll keep my ears open," Louise said softly, her voice reassuring. She had always been a quiet observer of people, and in their home. Her words were often enough to offer a counterpoint to Maigret's thoughts. He nodded, grateful for her, understanding, but the case was still on his mind as he finished his breakfast. He would return to the apartment today. He had questions yet to ask, things left unsaid in the conversation. But it wasn't just about the apartment or Thibault. Maigret had learned over the years that, sometimes, a crime's true nature could only be understood once you learned the rhythm of the lives that led to it. By noon, Maigret and his partner, Inspector Lognon, were back on the streets, making their way to a different part of Paris. The investigation had not yet led to any significant revelations, but Maigret's instincts were sharp, and they told him there was more to the story than the straightforward answers he had been given. Lognon, as always, was at Maigret's side, his round face etched with worry, The younger inspector was eager to make sense of things, and while Maigret appreciated his enthusiasm, he often found Lognin's eagerness a little too simplistic. The man had a talent for rushing into things, assuming that the answers would be clear if they just asked the right questions loud enough. "You think Thibault did it, boss?" Lognon asked, clearly trying to pin Maigret down. "I think Thibault knows something," Maigret replied, his voice calm but firm. "He's hiding it, but we'll get to it. Just give it time." Lognon muttered something under his breath, but Maigret ignored it. His mind was already on the next step. The story wasn't in the obvious places, and it certainly wasn't in the things people were willing to talk about. It was in the silence, in the pauses, in the bits of information people left out without even realizing it. They arrived at the apartment building where Delacroix had lived. The place had the same cold, drab air as the rest of Paris's older buildings. Its windows were fogged from the morning mist, and the hallway smelled faintly of old wood and dust. Maigret wasn't interested in the building itself. He was interested in the people who had known Delacroix and the emotions they had kept hidden in their everyday lives. The building manager, a thin, unremarkable man with nervous eyes, greeted them at the door. He led them up the creaky stairs to Delacroix's apartment, which was located on the top floor. As they passed the other apartments, Maigret could hear faint murmurs of conversation, doors opening and closing, but nothing too revealing. The kind of sounds that, when isolated, seemed like nothing yet in context. They always told you something. The manager opened the door to Delacroix's apartment. The place was almost exactly as Maigret had imagined it. Clean, minimalist, sparsely furnished. There were no personal touches, no warmth, just furniture ranged in the way it was expected to be. No photographs, no books stacked carelessly on tables, a life of routine, and perhaps of secrecy. "Did anyone visit Mr. Delacroix regularly?" Maigret asked, his voice still measured. Though his eyes were alert, the manager seemed uneasy at the question, but after a pause, he answered, "Not often, no one special. There was a man who came by once or twice, a friend, I suppose. I didn't know him well." "Who was he?" Maigret pressed. The manager looked around nervously before, lowering his voice. "I'm not sure. He was always very discreet, kept to himself. I've seen him talking to Mr. Delacroix in the building a few times, but that's about it. Not much else, really." The comment intrigued Maigret. A discreet visitor, someone who wasn't even noticed by the people who lived so close to Delacroix. It was the kind of detail that seemed small, but, for Maigret, it fit into the growing web of quiet contradictions. "Do you have a name?" Maigret asked, his tone still casual, as though it was just another small question. The manager hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. But after a few moments, he gave in. "Thibault," he said quietly. "Jean-Luc Thibault." Maigret nodded, his thoughts aligning like pieces of a puzzle. There it was, the same man, the nervousness, the evasion. It wasn't enough yet to make a direct accusation, but it was a clue, a small one, to be sure, but one that was beginning to fit with others. "Thank you," Maigret said, his voice flat. He turned to Lognon, who was standing quietly behind him, his eyes wide with unspoken questions. They didn't need to speak, though. Both knew this was far from over. Something about the whole situation was still off-kilter. And it wasn't just the visible details. Maigret sat at his desk late in the afternoon, the steady ticking of the clock on the wall marking the passage of time. The office was quiet, save for the occasional murmur of conversations in the hall outside. There had been no immediate breakthroughs in the case of the murder of Delacroix, and though Maigret was accustomed to the slow pace of such investigations, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something vital was just out of reach. He had learned long ago that cases like these cases without obvious motives, without clear-cut suspects, tended to unfold at their own pace. But that didn't make them any easier to endure. His thoughts were interrupted by the quiet sound of the office door creaking open. Inspector Lognon stepped in, holding a small envelope in his hand. "Something for you, boss," Lognon said, his voice low and somewhat tentative. Maigret looked up from his desk, raising an eyebrow. "It's not from anyone we've spoken to, is it?" he asked, not expecting much. The case was being worked by the book, but he had a sense that something more personal was involved, something the official reports couldn't capture. Lognon shook his head. "No, it's from your wife." Maigret's gaze softened. Louise's notes were never lengthy or filled with unnecessary sentiment, but they had a clarity that only she could provide. She had a way of saying things in just the right way, often, when he needed to hear them most. He opened the envelope slowly, and a folded piece of paper slid out. The words were written in her neat, familiar handwriting, and Maigret read them carefully. "Jean, I think you might be missing something. You've always been good at seeing the way people behave, and sometimes that's the key. But don't forget to look at their lives outside of the case, their homes, their families. We are all shaped by those things, even when we don't show it. I hope you find what you're looking for." The note was short, but it struck Maigret with the force of a revelation. She was right. He had been so focused on the mystery in the apartment, the strange behavior of Thibault, and the contradictions in the statements of the neighbors, that he hadn't stopped to consider the private lives of the people involved. Maigret's mind immediately turned to the idea of Holmes, what Delacroix's life might have been like behind the closed door of his apartment, and what the Beau's home might reveal about the man's character. Louise had always understood that the foundation of any crime lay in the lives of those who committed them. Maigret looked up at Lognon. "We're going to need to look at the Beau's life, his home, his background. There's something there, something I've missed." Lognon, looking slightly puzzled but eager to assist, nodded. "Got it. I'll see what I can dig up." Maigret watched Lognon leave the office and returned to his thoughts. Louise's words had given him a nudge, a quiet reminder that the answers to mysteries were often found in the spaces between the obvious details. He would take her advice seriously. A detective's job was never just about gathering evidence, it was about understanding the human beings involved, the things they had buried deep within themselves, and the ways they revealed those secrets. Without realizing it, that evening, Maigret found himself sitting in the familiar comfort of his apartment, where Louise had prepared a simple dinner of vegetable soup and bread. It wasn't anything extravagant, but it was enough. They didn't need to talk much during meals. Their silence was never uncomfortable. Over the years, they had perfected the art of sharing space without words. Maigret, as always, was lost in his thoughts, turning over the case in his mind. Louise set the last of the dishes aside and sat down opposite him, her presence a comforting constant. She wasn't one to ask about his work, but he could sense when something was on his mind. "You're thinking about it again," she said softly, glancing at him. "Thibaut," Maigret nodded. "Yes, but it's more than that. I can't quite put my finger on it. There's something beneath the surface with him. Yesterday, I could see it in his eyes. He's hiding something. And there's this sense that he's not just afraid of getting caught, but something deeper. He's tied to Delacroix in a way that doesn't make sense." Louise listened patiently, her eyes sharp and understanding. "What do you mean by tied?" Maigret paused for a moment, thinking. "There's a connection between them that goes beyond the surface. I spoke to the building manager today. Thibaut was seen with Delacroix often, but no one knows exactly who he is. There's something off about the way he's been avoiding questions, too. It's like he's not just trying to cover up the murder. He's trying to protect something else." "Maybe you're right," Louise said, her voice thoughtful. "Maybe it's not the murder he's afraid of. Maybe it's something else he's hiding. You'll find out when the time is right." Maigret looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and exhaustion. "You always know just what to say." She smiled, a faint but knowing expression. "I've learned a few things over the years, Jean." As they finished their meal in quiet contentment, Maigret's mind drifted back to Thibaut. The man was an enigma, and something about his life, his background, was crucial to understanding his role. In the murder, it was a feeling, a hunch, but it was strong enough to make him pause and reconsider everything he thought he knew. He knew he had to dig deeper. There were threads here, ones that, if pulled, could unravel the whole story. The following morning, Maigret and Lognon found themselves once again on the streets of Paris, this time heading to Thibaut's apartment. There was no rush, no urgency in their steps, just the steady, deliberate pace that Maigret had learned to follow when pursuing answers. They arrived at Thibaut's building, a less impressive structure than Delacroix's apartment, but still well-kept, with tidy hallways and a quiet, almost sterile atmosphere. Maigret had learned to read places like this. The quiet apartments were often the homes of people who preferred to remain hidden in the background, who cultivated a sense of normalcy that could mask a darker reality. Thibaut's door was unlocked when they arrived, and Maigret let himself in without hesitation. The apartment was modest, sparsely furnished, just as Maigret had expected. But there was something about it that felt different than Delacroix's something off, as if Thibaut was trying too hard to present a certain image. Lognon moved to the side, poking around the corners of the room, while Maigret took in the space with a calm, focused eye. He was looking for something, anything that might reveal more than the carefully constructed exterior. A picture frame caught his eye. It was small, simple, and framed by a picture of two people, a man and a woman, both looking happy, but the woman's eyes Margaret could tell were hiding something. He turned the frame toward him. Studying it closely, "Who's this?" Lognon asked, approaching with his usual enthusiasm. Margaret didn't answer immediately, instead placing the frame down gently on the table. The woman in the photo was important of that, he was certain. But there was something else in the room, something that had shifted. That suggested he was about to understand more than he realized. The day had slipped by quietly, the drizzle never ceasing as it softened the outlines of Paris and cast everything into a muted, almost melancholic haze. Margaret and Lognon had spent the afternoon sifting through Thibault's apartment, but it was clear to Margaret that the search had yielded little. The clues were scattered, too obscure to draw any immediate conclusions. But Margaret felt an unsettling tension in the pit of his stomach. Something was there, hidden in the quiet corners of the apartment, in the hesitation of Thibault's manner. But the man was as elusive as ever. Back at the station, Margaret allowed himself a moment of quiet contemplation. He sat in his usual chair, the one facing the window that overlooked the courtyard, letting the sound of the rain and the occasional car passing by offer a brief respite from the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. Louise's words came back to him. Look at their lives outside of the case, their homes, their families. It was simple advice, but in that simplicity, it held the answer. Margaret had to stop thinking in terms of motives as neat, calculable entities. The truth, he realized, was more like the rain falling steadily outside, gradual, shaping everything it touched, making its mark in small, unnoticed ways. As he sat there, lost in thought, the phone rang. It was Lognon, calling from the station's reception desk. "Chief, you might want to come down here. Thibault's wife is here. She says she has something important to tell you." The mention of Thibault's wife caught Margaret's attention immediately. It was the first time she had come forward, and Margaret had no doubt that her visit wasn't an accident. He stood up, adjusting his coat before making his way down the hall to meet her. When Margaret arrived at the reception desk, he saw her sitting there slight, with dark eyes that seemed to be perpetually looking beyond the present, beyond the room. She was thin, her posture betraying a certain tension, as if she were holding herself together by sheer force of will. Margaret took in the details of her appearance, the fine lines on her face, that suggested years of quiet endurance, the way she clasped her hands tightly in her lap. She didn't look like the sort of woman who would have married a man like Thibault. He had no idea what it was about her, but something about her presence seemed to unsettle him. "Madame Thibault," Margaret said softly, his voice calm and steady. She looked up at him, startled, but quickly composed herself. "Yes, Chief Inspector." Her voice faltered, and for a moment, Margaret saw something flicker in her eyes, a deep well of emotion, barely contained. "I need to talk to you about my husband," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret nodded, motioning for her to follow him to a quiet, private office. Once they were seated, he gave her time to speak, sensing that she needed a moment to gather her thoughts. The silence between them stretched out, but Margaret didn't rush her. In his experience, it was the moments of quiet before a confession that often revealed the most. After what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke. "Chief Inspector, I know that my husband is involved in something, but I don't know what. All I know is that he's different, and he's been acting strangely for months now." Her voice quivered as she spoke, and Maigret observed the subtle tremor in her hands. He could feel the weight of her words, the pain and fear that she tried to keep at bay. "I thought it was just the stress of work," she continued, "but now I realize something else is happening. He's been distant, avoiding me, and there are things I don't understand." Maigret waited patiently, his eyes never leaving her face. He knew that in such moments, it wasn't the words themselves that mattered most. It was the way they were spoken, the slight cracks in the voice, the little hints of guilt or fear that often revealed more than any physical evidence. "Can you be more specific?" he asked, his tone gentle but firm. She paused, taking a deep breath. "There's a woman," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I don't know who she is, but I've seen her a few times. She comes to the apartment, and Thibault, he's different when she's there, cold, detached. I can't explain it, but I've seen it. I know it's not just in my mind." Maigret's gaze sharpened. The mention of another woman struck him like a sudden blow. It was a classic motive: love, jealousy, and the complex web of betrayal that often formed the basis for such crimes. But there was something in the way Madame Thibault spoke that told him there was more. She wasn't just afraid of an affair. There was something else lurking in her words, a deeper unease. "Has your husband ever said anything about Delacroix?" Maigret asked Dot at the mention of Delacroix's name. Madame Thibault's face briefly contorted with something that could only be described as a fleeting, unspoken fear. It was gone in an instant, replaced by a tight-lipped expression, but Maigret had seen it. He knew now that her husband's connection to Delacroix went beyond simple professional rivalry or chance encounters. There was something personal there, something that tied the two men together in a way that Thibault had yet to reveal. "Delacroix?" she repeated, her voice cracking slightly. "No. He never spoke about him, not directly. But there were times when I could tell he was troubled. He would look at the papers, those pictures of Delacroix, and he'd get this look in his eyes, like he was haunted by something." Maigret leaned forward slightly, his mind racing. "What do you mean by haunted?" She hesitated for a long moment, then answered, "I don't know. It was like he was carrying something heavy, something he couldn't escape. He would just stare at the newspaper, then throw it away. Sometimes I would hear him muttering under his breath, but when I asked, he'd always say it was nothing." A silence hung in the room, thick with unspoken implications. Maigret could feel the tension in the air, the slow unraveling of a truth that was far more complex than anyone had anticipated. Thibault's guilt wasn't just born from fear of the law. It was something more deeply embedded in his psyche, something that perhaps even he didn't fully understand. His connection to Delacroix was both a weight and a trigger, one that had been building for months, maybe even years. Maigret stood slowly, his gaze never leaving Madame Thibault. I appreciate you coming forward. I believe you've given us something important, but I must ask you to think carefully. Has there been anything at all, that might help us understand your husband's connection to Delacroix? For a moment, she seemed lost in thought, her hands clutching the edges of her chair. Then, without warning, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. I think he's been seeing Delacroix more than I knew. I don't know what happened between them, but it wasn't good. I can feel it. Something terrible happened. Maigret felt the weight of her words. It was as if everything she had said so far had been leading up to this quiet confession. A piece of the puzzle had finally fallen into place. The connection between Thibault and Delacroix wasn't just a matter of jealousy or betrayal. It was something darker, something rooted in the past, something that neither man could escape. Thank you, Madame Thibault, Maigret said, his voice steady but his mind racing. We'll be in touch. As she stood to leave, Maigret watched her go, the door clicking shut behind her with an oddly final sound. He stood there for a moment, listening to the rain against the window, the distant hum of the city outside. He had learned something crucial today. The case had shifted, and now, more than ever, Maigret felt the tug of a truth he couldn't quite grasp. But he was getting closer. The night had come quietly to Paris, the city swaddled in the soft embrace of drizzle. For the first time in days, Maigret felt a certain stillness in the air, as though the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. He sat at his desk in the station, the faint glow of a desk lamp casting long shadows across the papers before him. The rain against the windows grew steady, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. It had been a long day, and he had not moved much from this place since the afternoon visit from Madame Thibault. Something about her quiet desperation lingered in his mind, a puzzle piece that refused to settle into place. He thought about her words, something terrible happened, and the look in her eyes. When she said it, whatever it was the key to the whole mystery. He was sure of it. He had already suspected that the relationship between Thibault and Delacroix was more complicated than it appeared on the surface, but Madame Thibault's words had sharpened his understanding. It wasn't just a case of an affair. No, something deeper, more dangerous had occurred between the two men. The phone rang, dragging Maigret from his thoughts. Maigret, he answered, his voice flat but attentive. Chief, it's Whodunit, came the voice on the other end. We've got something on Delacroix. It's not much, but you should come see. Maigret's brow furrowed. I'll be right there. The office was quiet when Maigret arrived, save for the occasional shuffle of papers and the soft hum of the fluorescent lights. Whodunit sat at his desk, flipping through a file with his usual air of melancholy. His face brightened, just slightly, when he saw Maigret. I've been going through Delacroix's records, Chief. Nothing too damning. But there's a small detail here that I think might be important, Whodunit said, sliding a sheet of paper across the desk. Maigret took it, his eyes scanning the page quickly. The document was a series of names people Delacroix had interacted with, business transactions, and what appeared to be addresses. He paused at one particular entry. Thibault. he muttered under his breath. The name stood out among a sea of others and remarkable to most, but significant to him. It was an address, one linked to a property in the outskirts of Paris, far from the bustling city centre. Whodunit. Do we know anything about this place? The address? Maigret asked, already knowing the answer. Whodunit nodded. It's a small house tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. It was rented under a fake name, but it checks out. Delacroix's been there, and we found a note from Thibault that was left there. It's dated just last week. Maigret's mind churned. This was it, the place where something terrible had happened. There had to be a reason for the secrecy, for the hidden rendezvous. Maigret turned to Whodunit, his voice firm. We need to go there now. Get the team together and bring Madame Thibault's statement. I have a feeling we're getting close. The house on the outskirts of Paris was unassuming, nestled between rows of old buildings that had long since surrendered their charm to the creeping encroachment of modernity. A narrow alley led to the front door, its paint peeling from years of neglect. The air was damp with the lingering scent of rain, and Maigret couldn't shake the feeling that the house, like the case itself, had secrets buried deep within its walls. Whodunit and a couple of officers were already waiting outside when Maigret arrived. They exchanged brief nods, and without a word, they entered the house, the hinges of the door protesting as they opened it. Inside, the place was eerily quiet, with dust motes swirling in the air, illuminated by the pale light filtering through grimy windows. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, and yet the faintest traces of recent habitation were visible. A cigarette butt in an ashtray, a broken chair pushed hastily against the wallet was as though someone had left in a hurry, leaving behind only the faintest signs of their presence. Maigret moved through the house methodically, taking in the details, as he always did. It was in the small things, the unmade bed, the half-closed door to a small room at the back, the overturned books on the floor. But nothing more. No evidence of violence, no struggle, just an atmosphere of neglect. But then he saw it, a piece of paper, half hidden beneath a table, caught on the edge of a chair leg. Maigret bent down, picking it up carefully, and unfurled it. It was a letter, scrawled in hurried handwriting, addressed to Thibault. The words were jagged, the ink smudged in places as if written under duress. We can't keep doing this. I don't want this anymore. It's gone too far, and now you're involved in things you don't understand. Stay away from me, or you'll regret it. I never wanted to hurt anyone, but you've left me no choice. Maigret read the note again. The implications were clear. Thibault and Delacroix's relationship wasn't just a matter of business or rivalry. There was something darker beneath the surface. Thibault had been dragged into something far beyond his control. Something that involved manipulation, fear, and possibly even murder. Delacroix had given Thibault a warning, but that wasn't enough. It never was. Now, Maigret had the sense that the Beau's involvement was more complex than simple complicity. It was the very reason for the tragedy that had yet to fully unfold. Later that evening, Maigret returned home to his apartment. The rain had stopped, but the sky was heavy, as if burdened with the weight of all that had been left unsaid. He hung up his coat, sat down at the kitchen table, and poured himself a glass of brandy. The case had taken a different turn. It was no longer about the immediate crime. It was about what had happened before. What was hidden beneath the surface? His wife, Louise, entered the room quietly, her expression soft but tired. She set a cup of tea on the table in front of him and sat down across from him. "You look like you've been through a storm," she said, her voice gentle. Maigret smiled faintly, his eyes lingering on her for a moment before he took a sip of his brandy. "There are times, Louise," he said softly, "when a person's whole life can lead them to one moment, one choice that changes everything. It's a heavy burden to carry." Louise raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Maigret stared out the window, watching the darkened streets below, feeling the weight of his own thoughts. Thibault is involved in something terrible. But it wasn't just about the crime. It's about the lies that led to it, the things people do out of fear, out of guilt, things that make a person unrecognizable to themselves. He paused, as if weighing his next words carefully. "I think Delacroix and Thibault both knew something about each other, something they never spoke of. But it was the fear of what would happen if they did speak that made everything spiral out of control." Maigret's voice trailed off, and for a long moment, neither he nor Louise spoke. The room was heavy with unspoken understanding. The case was still unfolding, but the truth, Maigret knew, had already started to reveal itself one quiet, painful piece at a time. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the rain had returned to Paris. Softer now, like a whispered apology for the storms of the previous days. The streets gleamed under the streetlights, their surfaces still wet, reflecting the dim glow of the lamps in shimmering puddles. Maigret walked slowly, his hands tucked into his coat pockets, his mind adrift with thoughts that seemed to float like smoke, disconnected, elusive. The investigation had reached its final stages, and the heavy weight of it was beginning to settle over him. But there was still something, an uneasy feeling, a lingering doubt that wouldn't leave him as he strolled through the quiet streets. His thoughts wandered back to the house on the outskirts of Paris. The note from Delacroix to Thibault had been a revelation, a final thread pulling the disparate parts of the case together. Yet, something about the whole affair still gnawed at him. It wasn't just the crime that troubled him, it was the way people's lives became intertwined. How one decision, one betrayal, could lead to a spiraling descent into darkness. Maigret stopped in front of a small cafe, its windows fogged from the heat inside. The bell above the door rang softly as he entered. The warmth enveloped him, and he made his way to a small table by the window, his usual corner. The cafe was nearly empty, save for a few patrons lost in their own conversations, their voices muffled by the low hum of the rain. Maigret sat down and ordered a coffee, the bitter aroma a welcome distraction from the whirlwind of thoughts. A few minutes passed before he heard a familiar voice. "Is this seat taken?" asked the voice, a bit hesitant, but warm. Maigret looked up to find Madame Thibault standing at the edge of his table. She was slightly out of breath, as though she had hurried to catch up with him. Her face was pale, but there was a certain determination in her eyes. She looked older than her years, worn down by the weight of the secrets she had carried for so long. The veil of fear that had clouded her earlier visits was gone, replaced by something quieter, more resigned. "No," Maigret said, his tone even. "Please, sit." She hesitated for a moment before pulling out the chair across from him and sitting down slowly, as though the action required more effort than it should. She didn't speak at first, and Maigret waited. He had learned that silence often revealed more than words ever could. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and steady. "I came to thank you." Maigret raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He had heard such words before, though usually they were accompanied by some sense of relief or gratitude. With Thibault, there was none of that. Instead, it was as though her words were more of a concession and acknowledgement that the truth, however painful, had to be faced. "For what?" Maigret asked, his gaze steady but unintrusive. "For not arresting me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For not pushing me into something I wasn't ready to say. You were patient with me, more than I deserved." Maigret took a sip of his coffee, letting the bitter taste linger before he set the cup down. "You don't need to thank me," he said simply. "It wasn't about what you said. It was about what you didn't say. And that was enough." Madame Thibault nodded, her eyes downcast as she traced the rim of her cup with her finger. For a moment, Maigret could see the turmoil that had been eating at her from the inside. She had been trapped in a situation that she hadn't fully understood. A situation that had spun out of control long before the murder. "I never meant for it to happen," she whispered. "I never meant for him to die. But it was always there, wasn't it? The lies, the secrets. It was inevitable." Maigret said nothing, his gaze fixed on her. He didn't need to say anything. The truth had already been laid bare between them, complicated, messy, and human. "It's the things we hide," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "The things we think we can bury. But they never stay buried, do they? They just wait, lurking under the surface, until one day Her voice faltered, and Maigret could see the tears welling in her eyes. He reached across the table, his hand resting briefly on hers, a gesture of quiet solidarity. It wasn't often that he offered such comfort, but something about Madame Thibault made him feel as though she deserved it. She had been trapped by her own guilt, cornered by a past she could never escape. But now, in the final moments of their conversation, she was on the verge of releasing it all. "I should have known better," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I should have known that nothing good could come from keeping secrets. But I was too afraid of losing everything I had, even if it was built on lies." Maigret nodded, understanding. People did terrible things out of fear of losing their loved ones, their reputations, their sense of control. It was a truth he had seen again and again throughout his years as a detective. People were never as simple as their actions. They were driven by forces far beyond their understanding. And sometimes, in trying to protect themselves, they ended up destroying everything they held dear. "You're not the first person to be afraid," Maigret said, his voice steady. "But you're also not the first to realize that fear only makes things worse. It's not the secrets that matter in the end, Madame Thibault. It's the truth that comes afterward, the choices you make now. She looked up at him, her expression weary but resolute. What happens now? She asked, her voice fragile. Maigret sighed, his eyes softening. That depends on you, he replied. The truth is already out. What matters now is how you live with it. She sat in silence for a long while, as though weighing his words. Maigret watched her, sensing the delicate shift in the air around them. There was no dramatic confession, no grandiose scene of revelation, just a quiet acceptance that the past was behind her and that the future would have to be faced, no matter how difficult it might be. The next few days passed in a blur for Maigret. He spent most of his time at the station, reviewing the case and speaking with the remaining witnesses. But the resolution felt inevitable now. The truth had come out, slowly and quietly, and the pieces had fallen into place when the arrest came. It was not accompanied by fanfare or a rush of excitement. It was simply a man, Delacroix, who had made a series of decisions that led him to this moment. He had been driven by jealousy, by greed, and by a desire for control. But in the end, his actions had been no different from anyone else's who had ever tried to escape the consequences of their choices. Maigret sat in his office, watching the rain fall outside. The case was over. The suspect was in custody. The answers had been found. But even as the investigation drew to a close, Maigret felt no satisfaction, no sense of triumph, only the quiet, lingering truth that no matter how many cases he solved, no matter how many criminals he apprehended, the mysteries of human nature would always remain just out of reach. The telephone rang again, pulling him from his thoughts. Maigret. He answered, his voice weary. It's over, Chief, came the voice on the other end. Delacroix is in custody. Everything's wrapped up. Maigret didn't respond immediately. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. He had known it was coming, but it still felt like something heavy had lifted from his chest. And yet, the feeling of emptiness remained, a reminder that the case had never really been about Delacroix or Thibault, or even the murder. It had always been about the slow unraveling of the human soul, the things we hide from others, and from ourselves. Good, Maigret finally said, his voice a low murmur. Good. And with that, he hung up the phone and turned his gaze back to the rain-slicked streets below. It was over, but the questions, the quiet truths, would linger long after the case had been closed, and Maigret would always carry them with him, as he had carried all the others. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a thick, dense fog that hung over Paris like a heavy blanket. The streets were eerily quiet, almost as if the city itself was holding its breath. The neon signs, once vibrant and proud, now seemed muted in the mist, casting pale reflections onto the slick cobblestones below. Even the sound of the wind felt muffled. The usual hustle and bustle of the city diminished by the heavy stillness of the air. Chief Inspector Maigret stood at the window of his office, staring out into the haze, his thoughts as clouded as the cityscape before him. The case was closed now, or at least the investigation had come to an official end. Delacroix was in custody. The charges were clear. and the pieces of the puzzle had finally clicked into place. Yet, Maigret found himself restless, a quiet unease. Gnawing at him, the mystery had been solved, but he knew that mysteries never truly ended. The answers were always partial, fleeting, like wisps of smoke that slipped through your fingers just as you thought you had them pinned down. The truth, as always, had revealed itself in fragments, one small piece at a time, until it was finally laid bare. But Maigret understood better than most that the truth, once uncovered, rarely provided the peace it promised. He hadn't seen Madame Thibault since their conversation in the café. She had left him that day with a somber nod, a small, unreadable smile that told him nothing and everything at once. There was something about her, a quiet strength, perhaps, or simply the weariness of someone who had lived too long in the shadows, that made Maigret think that her journey was far from over. People like her, caught between guilt and relief, often walked away from the truth with a heavy heart, carrying the burden of what they had done for the rest of their lives. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming idly on the desk as he let his mind wander. The case had been straightforward in its own way. Delacroix had killed Thibault's husband out of jealousy, fear, and the desire for control. The motive was as old as time itself: love, betrayal, and the weight of unspoken desires. But what had truly unsettled him wasn't the murder itself, but the quiet, unspoken world of these ordinary people who had become entangled in something far more complicated than they had ever expected. Their emotions, their hesitations, their silences, they had all led Maigret to the truth. But they had also left him wondering just how well we ever truly understand each other. "Inspector," a voice interrupted his thoughts. Maigret turned to see Inspector Lognon standing in the doorway, his expression serious as always. Lognon was one of those officers who never seemed to leave the shadows, always lurking on the fringes of every investigation. His presence both a comfort and a reminder of the bureaucracy that Maigret had long ago learned to navigate with patience. "What is it, Lognon?" Maigret asked, his voice tinged with quiet curiosity. "There's a visitor for you, sir." "A woman, Madame Thibault." Maigret's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. He had expected this visit, though the timing caught him off guard. He stood up slowly, adjusting his coat, and nodded to Lognon to let him know he'd handle it. The door clicked shut behind him as he made his way down the narrow corridor toward the entrance. His steps soft on the worn floorboards as he reached the front of the building. He spotted her standing near the entrance, a figure framed by the faint light from the street lamp outside. Her silhouette was barely visible through the frosted glass door, but Maigret could tell it was her Madame Thibault, dressed in a long, dark coat, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. She didn't appear to notice him at first, her eyes fixed on the street beyond, as though she was waiting for something or perhaps trying to avoid something. He opened the door without a word, and she turned quickly at the sound of his approach. Her face was drawn, but there was a determination in her gaze, something Maigret hadn't seen before. "You've come," he said, stepping aside to let her in. She nodded, but didn't speak immediately. Instead, she glanced around the room. as though taking in the familiar yet foreign surroundings. The office was small, crammed with papers and old files, but there was a sense of comfort in its disorder, a quietness that Margaret had come to appreciate over the years. "May I?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes now resting on the chair opposite Margaret's desk. Margaret nodded again, gesturing for her to sit. He returned to his own chair, watching her closely. He had learned by now that there was always more to a case than what was presented on the surface. And even though the investigation had ended, he sensed that there was something still unsettled in her, something that had yet to be said. "I wanted to thank you again," she said, after a long pause, "for everything you've done, and for not forcing me to say what I wasn't ready to say." Margaret didn't reply immediately. Instead, he studied her, taking in the subtle tremor in her hands, the way her shoulders sagged slightly as though the weight of the world was still pressing down on her. It was clear that she hadn't come here for gratitude. There was something else in her eyes, something that told him this conversation wasn't about the past, but about the future. "You didn't have to come here for that," Margaret replied quietly. "I've done my job, and now it's up to you." She looked at him, her expression pained. "I know," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "but I've been thinking. I can't leave it like this. The things I've done, the lies I've told, they've been haunting me. And now, with everything that's happened, I realize that I don't know how to live with them." Margaret sat back in his chair, his gaze softening. He had heard similar words countless times before, from criminals, from victims, from people caught in the web of their own choices. Guilt was a heavy burden to carry, but it was also something that people often held onto out of fear of facing the truth, fear of what might come after. "Why now?" Margaret asked, his tone gentle, but probing. "Why come to me after all this time?" She hesitated, her eyes flickering with indecision. Then, with a sigh, she lowered her gaze to the floor. "Because I need to understand something. You were right, you know, about the truth, about what happens after we face it. But I've been living with this fear, this secret, for so long. And now that it's out in the open, I don't know how to move on. I don't know how to live with it." Margaret studied her for a long time, his silence heavy in the air between them. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "You've already begun," he said. "The first step is always the hardest, but once you take it, the rest will follow." She looked up at him, her eyes wide, as though she hadn't expected such a simple answer. "And what if it doesn't?" Margaret's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Then you take another step." For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Margaret could feel the tension slowly dissipating, as though the conversation had allowed something to shift within her. She wasn't free from her past, not yet, but perhaps, just perhaps, she was beginning to see a way forward. "I should go," she said after a while, standing up and smoothing her coat. She paused, looking at him once more. "Thank you, Inspector, for everything." Margaret stood as well, nodding. "Good luck, Madame Thibault, and remember, the truth isn't the end. It's only the beginning. She gave him a small smile, the first genuine one he had seen from her in weeks. And then she turned and walked out the door. Margaret watched her disappear into the fog, her figure fading into the night. As the door closed behind her, he felt the familiar quiet settle back into the room. The case was over, but the questions would linger, as they always did. He sat back down at his desk, letting out a long breath, the weight of the day finally lifting. He had solved the mystery, but there was still so much more to understand. The truth, as always, was both clearer and more elusive than he could ever fully grasp. And yet, in that silence, in the quiet aftermath of it all, Margaret knew that he had done what he could. Now, it was time to wait for the next mystery to come. The fog had deepened overnight, rolling across the city in ghostly waves. From the Seine to the Marais, the air was thick with damp and the smell of chimney smoke. Paris seemed to sleep more heavily under this veil, as if unwilling to wake from a dream that hadn't quite ended. But in the corridors of the police bureau, something had stirred. Chief Inspector Margaret returned to his office early that morning with a sense of unfinished business clinging to him like mist to his coat. Though Delacroix had confessed, though the murder of Gerard Thibault had been officially closed, a new letter had arrived just hours ago. It was unsigned. Typed. No return address. And worse, its content was not the ramblings of some newspaper addict or attention seeker. You think you've heard the last of this, but there's more to his death than your man in chains. Ask yourself why Madame Thibault still lies when no one's asking her to. Ask yourself who really benefited from Gerard's silence. Margaret had read it twice, then a third time. He hadn't shown it to Whodunit yet. No need to spread panic or restart a media circus. But the words wouldn't leave his mind. They slithered into the cracks of the case, into the parts that never quite aligned. Madame Thibault had said little, too little for a woman who had been emotionally entangled in such a crime. Her sorrow had seemed sincere, yes, but her relief was too fast, too smooth. And Gerard, though every report painted him as a quiet man with secrets, Margaret had always felt the man was more frightened than deceitful. Perhaps someone else had kept him frightened. Margaret lit a pipe and leaned back, letting the tobacco settle his thoughts. He thought of Madame Thibault again. There had always been something carefully constructed about her, like a statue that didn't want to be touched. The grief had looked real. But now he questioned if it had been grief for her husband, or grief for what she knew would eventually be uncovered. If someone else had benefited from Gerard's death, who could it have been? A knock on the door interrupted him. He glanced up. "Come in," he said. Whodunit entered, a thin file in hand. "You'll want to see this," he said without preamble. "I double-checked the financials on Gerard's accounts. At the time of his death, he had recently withdrawn a large sum of money, 40,000 francs. No trace of where it went." Margaret took the file. How recent? 2 days before the murder. Margaret frowned. And this wasn't part of the original report. "No," Whodunit replied, annoyed. "The bank records only arrived this morning. Some backlog with their legal department." Margaret stared at the numbers. 40,000 francs gone. Gerard didn't strike him as they typed to run, and he certainly wasn't extravagant. Did his wife know? She didn't mention it in questioning, Lognon said. But then again, she wasn't asked. Maigret stood, his coat already in hand. I think it's time we ask. The Thibault apartment looked unchanged, still quiet, still proper. A faint scent of lavender floated through the air when Madame Thibault opened the door. She was dressed in grey this time, her hair neatly tied back, her eyes a little more alert than before. "Inspector," she said, surprised but not unwelcoming. "Is something wrong? May I come in?" Maigret asked, his tone neutral. She stepped aside without question. Inside, the apartment was as immaculately kept as before. He noticed new flowers on the sideboard, white lilies, a symbol of mourning, or purity, or secrets. "I won't take much of your time," Maigret said. "Just a few follow-up questions." "Of course," she said. "Is this about Delacroix?" "No," Maigret said, carefully watching her face. "It's about your husband." She stiffened slightly. "I thought we had closed that chapter." "I thought so too," Maigret replied, until a few new facts surfaced. Like the 40,000 francs your husband withdrew 2 days before his death. Her eyes didn't widen, nor did her mouth fall open in surprise. Instead, she lowered herself into a chair with graceful composure. "I didn't think it was relevant," she said softly. "You knew?" Maigret asked. "I did. Gerard told me he was going to give it to someone. To whom? He didn't say." "And you didn't ask?" "I did," she replied quietly. "But he wouldn't tell me. He only said that if he did, I'd be in danger too." Maigret felt his breath still. "Did he say why?" "He said it was protection money," she said. "To make something go away." "What thing?" "I don't know," she said, her voice tightening. "I swear to you, I don't know." Maigret stared at her a long moment. She didn't avert her gaze, but behind her eyes there was fear again, new this time, more immediate. "And Delacroix?" he asked. "Do you think he knew about the money?" "I don't think Gerard trusted him that far," she said. "Delacroix was obsessed with me. Gerard knew that. He hated him, but he wasn't afraid of him." "Then who was he afraid of?" She didn't answer right away. Maigret could hear the ticking of the clock behind him, loud in the silence. "Inspector," she said slowly, "have you ever heard the name Victor Dufresne?" The name dropped like a stone in water. Victor Dufresne, ex-smuggler, turned business magnate. No proven crimes in the last 10 years, but always a whisper in the corners of Paris. Drugs, extortion. Maigret had tried, more than once, to dig into his dealings. But Dufresne had friends in high places and a legal team stronger than most governments. "What was Gerard's connection to Dufresne?" Maigret asked. "He used to work in one of Dufresne's warehouses. Years ago, he said he saw something once, a shipment that was never meant to be seen. Drugs, I think, or weapons. I don't know, but he said Dufresne never forgot. And after all this time, there was a man," she said. "Gerard said he came by 3 nights before he died. Told him to keep his mouth shut. Told him there were people still watching, that they didn't forget." "And you never reported this?" She gave him a sad, almost pitying smile. To who, Inspector? The police. Dufresne has half of them in his pocket. Maigret stood, heart pounding quietly beneath his coat. He had walked into this room expecting loose ends, not a doorway to an entirely new threat. "You'll need protection," he said. She nodded. "I know." Maigret moved toward the door. "If what you're saying is true, this case isn't over. Not by a long shot." As he stepped into the hallway, the fog greeted him again, thicker now, pressing against the windows and doors like a warning. The silence of the city was deceptive. Beneath it, something darker pulsed. The mystery of Gerard the Beau's death had been only a prelude. And in the shadows of Paris, the real game was only just beginning. The city of Paris was a slow river of activity, never quite moving fast enough to catch the attention of a casual observer, but always turning, shifting, just beneath the surface. And Maigret, calm, methodical, was attuned to its quiet hum. He had spent his life listening to these whispers, knowing when to remain still and when to act. But today, as he sat in his office with the fog thickening outside, a sense of unease gnawed at him. The last piece had shifted, and now there was no turning back. He sat with the envelope before him, the address still clean and neat, as though it had just been printed. Inside, there was a note, written in the same careful script as the last. "Dufresne knows you're getting closer. His people are watching. Be careful, Maigret." It was unsigned again, the same typewriter, but this time there was an added weight to it, a threat, veiled and sinister. Maigret's eyes narrowed. The stakes were higher now. Dufresne wasn't just a shadow in the periphery anymore. He was an active player, and that made the game much more dangerous. Maigret had always known Paris to be a place where power played its games in the shadows. But this felt different. For the first time in a long while, Maigret felt as if he were being drawn into something larger than a simple murder case. He leaned back in his chair and let the pipe between his fingers go cold. There was no point rushing into anything now. The web was being spun slowly, carefully, and he had to be patient. His instincts, however, were already telling him that this was more than just a murder gone wrong. The office door creaked open, and Whodunit appeared again, looking more harried than before. "Inspector, there's something you need to see. It's about Dufresne." Maigret raised an eyebrow but said nothing, motioning for him to continue. "We've traced his movements," Whodunit said, dropping a thick stack of papers on the desk. "He wasn't just some reformed businessman. He's been involved in illegal activities for the last 2 years, under the radar. We didn't have enough to go public, but it's clear he's been laundering money, using legitimate businesses as a front." Maigret sifted through the papers. Some of the names listed were ones he recognized, old contacts from the past, both criminals and officials who had long kept their distance from Maigret's investigations. But the most significant name on the list was one he hadn't expected: Bernard Pirelli, a former associate of Gerard Thibault, the same man who had been rumored to be involved with Dufresne in some shady dealings years ago. "Why is this important?" Maigret asked, his voice quiet but probing. "This doesn't tell me much." Whodunit hesitated for a moment before speaking. as if reluctant to admit what he suspected. "We've had a tip. Pirelli's been in Paris recently. No one's seen him, but his signature's been appearing in various transactions linked to Dufresne. He's not hiding, Maigret. He's been watching." Maigret felt his pulse quicken. Pirelli was the missing link, the one who could connect the dots. And if he were involved with Dufresne in any meaningful way, well, that changed everything. "Kidney Pirelli," Maigret said, standing up from his chair. "Where should I?" Lognon started to ask. Maigret cut him off. "We'll find him. We always do." Hours later, Maigret stood outside an unmarked building on Rue de la Villette, his face shrouded in the grey drizzle of the Parisian evening. The street was quiet, save for the occasional passerby, their faces downturned and wrapped in scarves to shield from the cold wind. A dull hum of a distant motorbike echoed down the street, but Maigret remained still, his mind churning through everything he had learned. The buildings here were old, some dating back centuries, and yet they seemed impervious to the changes of time. It was as though the city itself had decided it would never be fully known, always hiding something. Behind its doors, its walls, the door to the building opened, and Lognon emerged, looking frustrated. "He's gone, Maigret," Lognon said, shaking his head. "Not a sign of him. No one saw him leave. No one remembers him coming in." Maigret remained calm, his eyes scanning the street. There were no sudden movements, no hurried footsteps, no one who seemed out of place. This was nothing more than a small game of cat and mouse, but Maigret's instincts told him that Pirelli wouldn't vanish so easily. "I don't believe he's gone," Maigret said slowly, his voice low but certain. "We'll try again tomorrow. Tonight, we wait." Later that evening, Maigret returned home to a quiet apartment, the familiar scent of his wife's perfume still lingering in the air. Madame Maigret was already in the kitchen, preparing a simple dinner, her movements as calm and deliberate. "As always, you're late," she said softly, glancing up at him. "Any progress?" Maigret didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved to the small window overlooking the street. He watched as the fog thickened, swallowing the lights from passing cars, creating halos of dim light that cut through the mist. He had seen this scene countless times, yet tonight it felt different, more oppressive, as if the city itself was hiding something beneath its surface. "The case is far from over," Maigret said finally, his voice almost a whisper. "But there's something else, something troubling." She didn't ask for details. She never did. She knew Maigret would speak when he was ready. But he felt her eyes on him, soft, understanding. It was the kind of silent support that didn't need words. "There are things at play here, things I don't fully understand yet," he continued, his voice barely above a murmur. "But one thing's certain, we're being watched." "By who?" Madame Maigret asked, setting the utensils down and moving closer to him. "By Dufresne, I think," Maigret said, finally turning to face her. "By Pirelli, and by anyone else who doesn't want this case to reach its conclusion." "Be careful," she said quietly, her eyes soft with concern. "I don't like this, Jules. There's something dangerous about it." Maigret smiled faintly, though his thoughts were far from calm. Danger has always been part of the job. But even as he spoke the words, a part of him knew this case was unlike any he had handled before. This wasn't just about finding the killer. This was about uncovering a larger conspiracy, a hidden hand pulling the strings behind the scenes. And at its heart, a man who had tried to disappear Gerard Thibault had somehow become the key to something much larger than a simple murder. And, in that moment, as the fog wrapped itself around the city, Margaret could feel the weight of the truth coming closer, and he knew it was only a matter of time before the full story would reveal itself.